We're no longer preaching to the choir, so to speak. There's always been a cult thing around mantra of people who really love it and are really excited and have come up either through yoga or different Eastern traditions. But now I'm hearing that this record is landing with people who don't know anything about it. And they're just like, it sounds cool. I like the mantras. There's something that affects me energetically about it. I don't know exactly what it's about, but it makes me feel good. People like having it on because in some ways the sound of the Sanskrit affects them in a way that's beautiful, but it also doesn't attract your attention in the same way that, say, English lyrics would. So a lot of people seem to like the vibe of it. And I love the fact that mantra music could start to be played in circles that normally wouldn't necessarily have ever been exposed to this. And I think it opens the door to something else in I guess I'll say the American experiment. And when I say that, I mean not just North America. I also mean South America, or it's a Western Hemisphere thing of a way that we're integrating Eastern traditions and combining them with other means of approaching spirituality musically and sending it back, somehow transformed. But it's not a matter of like trying to dress up in Indian clothing. It's actually recognizing that the tradition of kirtan that we're responding to is something that has always been recombinant. If you look back at the history of it, I mean, we're using instruments right now that are the product of the incursions of the Muslim world, of British imperialism. Like kirtan is like, okay, that sounds good. We'll take that. And, making an amalgam that transcends a particular culture. So it's not really weird from my perspective to start to put banjos or accordions or lap steel or acoustic guitar on this stuff. It just feels normal and natural.
Natural. Yeah, like an evolution of the sound of mantra to be more accessible to people. Absolutely.
Right. And you would always have to use the instruments that you had in front of you. The point is to connect and to get people to respond. And one of the things that I and many other artists have learned on the road all these years is that you want to produce a response from people. Westerners are used to singing along with acoustic guitars. So the minute you introduce that into the mix, they're familiar in a way and they're like, oh, I get that.
Right. Absolutely.
So really our methods here have to do with our need to share it and to connect and elicit a response. It's not an affectation of like, hey, doesn't this sound cool? Although it does sound cool. But it's really a means of pulling an audience in and becoming involved, because the music itself is transformational. If you're listening to it, you get one thing. If you sing along, you get another thing.
So tell us about this album, Mantra Americana. Why is it special? Why is it nominated for the Grammys? It's getting a lot of attention. It's actually a great opportunity that very few artists had the honor of receiving, to be nominated. So why is this album special? What is the story behind it?
Well, it has a predecessor. Madi and I made a record together years ago called Bhakti Without Borders. And we made it in my studio, really meeting every Thursday night, working on it compositionally. And we had a lot of personal involvement with it. The stakes were low. It was Madi's first album. I'd never produced an album for another artist. The budget was low. And we were just doing it because he approached me with an interesting project. He's out of the ISKCON or Hare Krishna movement, I guess you would call it. And second generation, and he's really coming from that particular devotional practice, which often has a certain sound to its music.
Yes.
And he wanted to step out of that, because one of my first questions is, well, why are you approaching me? I'm not actually from that tradition. I mean, I'm coming out of, for those of you who know about this sort of thing, a Shaivite tradition. And there's a little bit of a different methodology to the way the chants develop, or even the content of the chants. And he said that he wanted to step out of his tradition and create something that embraced a larger audience. So he found me. And we started to create Bhakti Without Borders. And what was happening is he was translating, I suppose, bits and pieces of melodies and words that he remembered from his childhood in India, and growing up in that tradition, which never involves guitars. Okay, from a sonic perspective, there's never a guitar involved. And so the first thing I was like, well, let me see if I can find that on an acoustic guitar, which changed the vibe of it immediately. And then it starts to put it into this context where I'm like, well, okay, let's sing a harmony on that, which is also never done. And I remember living in an ashram in India and naturally singing harmonies on things. And they would be like, you can't do that. I'm like, well, I think I just did. No, we don't do that here. That's your ego that just wants to express itself. And I thought about it. I was like, no, this is natural. Like in the West, in spiritual music, we sing harmonies. It's like there's hundreds of years of this tradition. That's how we express ourselves. So we're just adding something that's natural to us. And the point of intersection is that Indian music is modal, and so is bluegrass and country music and Irish music.
Interesting.
And so there's a point of congruence there that we're just sitting on top of. So I start playing these things on the guitar and start singing harmony to what Madi is doing. And all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, what if we combine tabla with pedal steel? Or what if we used banjo where you might have used ektar or dotar or something like that? And so the experiment came together. But we, on the first record, had all this personal time to develop this. We got nominated for a Grammy for that first one straight out of the box, which itself was a complete surprise. We didn't win. We learned a thing or two. And Madi moved from LA to Australia. His wife is Australian. He took a job with the Victoria Film Commission. And when we started, the wheel came around like, hey, let's make another record. We had just started writing it and communicating by Zoom, and then the pandemic hit. And all of a sudden, we really couldn't get together. And we fortunately had a relationship that had already been established in terms of how we wrote. So now we had to do this via Zoom, which is not really great for sound. So we had to both learn how to use Pro Tools much better and share sessions. And Madi would record stuff and I would record stuff. And often he'd sing something and put it to a mridangam beat, or he'd play a cajon, and so I would get the feel of it, and then I would organize it, and often, sometimes with the jazz ear, put certain chords underneath it, or formally kind of put it in a shape that was more like a pop song. And in doing this, we started steadily editing out certain features of the music and emphasizing other ones. We also have to respond to the medium we're in on Spotify. You have 20 seconds to get people's attention. So one of the first things that went, sadly, is lengthy introductions.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So many of the songs just start right off the bat with, Madi's voice starts it, or there's some drum pickup thing that like hits you and gets your attention, but you go straight into it. One thing that's really useful about Indian music versus Western music, okay, is in the West, we tend to put verses and choruses come later. So a conventional pop song would go like verse, chorus. Like it would take a little while to get to the point. Indian bhajans don't do that. They actually start with the hook. So in a certain way, like that's a useful feature in terms of the modern era. So that's actually how part of this got constructed too.
So some of the songs in the album start with the chorus itself.
Yeah. But that's what Indian music does too. It's a folk tradition. Kirtan is meant to elicit people singing along. So in some ways the melodies are simple, or they're meant to like get you involved right away. That said, there's also in this record a lot of more complicated mantras, some of them in Bengali, which is a spoken language. Sanskrit is the seed language of all these, in the same way that Latin is a seed language for Spanish or Portuguese or French or English. So,
what are the instruments that are part of the compositions?
Well, we're trying to have them equally Eastern and Western, okay? So from a traditional standpoint, you would use a mridangam or tabla. and finger cymbals would drive it, and then often a harmonium, which is a little pump organ. I'm sitting in front of one right here, and that would tend to play the melody, and the other ones would play the groove. So in some ways, we can reduce all those things down to that. But actually, compositionally, once a guitar gets involved in it, there's a chord structure to it, and that's not something that Indian music does naturally. But yet it fits right on top of it. And so we start experimenting with chord structures, and sometimes the second time it comes around, I would change the chords so that there's an alternative chord, for people who understand music theory, like what was D minor is now B flat major 7, and, we would change the bass note around. So actually at this point, if I was going to play the songs for somebody and I just had an acoustic guitar, that's actually where they more naturally sit now. So we're also using the cajon, which in terms of the way Kirtan it resolves a lot of world music together, my understanding is you hear cajon a lot now in flamenco music, but it really came from Peru, where the dock workers would sit on wooden boxes and play a rhythm. And I think Paco de Lucia heard that and imported it into flamenco music, where it's now become really a very significant signature sound of flamenco. They used to just do the percussion with their feet.
Right. Yeah.
So we now have this hybrid form, and it's like a drum set in a box is the thing. It's easy to carry around, it's really light, and it's groovy. So we're resolving in this record, Mantra Americana, an enormous amount of world traditions into something that on its face seems very simple, but we have drums who have origins in Persia and the Muslim world, and in the South American world, meeting, Indian percussion. We have harmonium whose origin is French and English. We have guitars and dulcimers and banjos and things that are synonymous with bluegrass or Irish music, accordions. So I don't know who's appropriating from who. As a musician, everybody's borrowing and saying that sounds good and transmitting it through their own experience. That's what we're doing with this record.
It's uniting the whole world sonically, and also spiritually is bringing all that flavor of the East into the West, which is something that we actually need, because more and more people are thinking, how can I get into a state of peace? How can I unplug from the mind?
Right.
I need something that helps me.
This is a really important point, is that what we've shifted from is a spirituality that's based upon like a belief or an ideology, and one that's more focused on the effect or the practice of it. People want to feel peaceful or be able to concentrate better or to open a channel of ecstasy and community. And these practices of yoga, of meditation, of singing together in the form of kirtan convey an experience that in many ways is inarguable. It's beyond discussion. And it creates a feeling of community and connection that almost really can't be described, but it can be experienced. That's an interesting experiment that's going on in world spirituality.
Yes, absolutely. Something new. Even though it's ancient, we are perceiving it as something new, and it's breaking through the mainstream.
Right.
And I think that all the chant artists are seeing this opportunity more than just one nomination, as bringing this whole category of music into the mainstream so that people can actually take it to the next level. So what do you think is going to happen if you win the Grammy? This is going to open doors for every single musician in this field.
Well, I hope it does. I hope it's the first of many. If we win a Grammy, it instantly achieves a credibility for chant in a way that it'll be perceived seriously as a cultural phenomenon where it's always been a little bit dismissed as a culty thing. It might be a cult, but it's a worldwide one, and it involves musicians really like in every continent. And I think that, that plays to people's desire to want to connect. Interesting that we made this record during the pandemic when we could not connect. And yet that longing is there. Interesting that in some ways we're now reflecting back to the source, to India, something that's been transmuted. the tradition itself was always really innovative, and yet in India it had become kind of like a museum piece, and it was no longer something relevant to people's lives. You know, it was like, oh yeah, they're doing that over in the temple, and I'm busy doing other things. But here in the West, it was freed of some of those less pleasant cultural associations. And instead of being perceived as something old, it was perceived as something new. And people have, marketed the ancient roots and everything. But it always felt to me like people were apologizing for what was actually going on, which was that we were creating something new.
Yes.
And in the same way that, for example, jazz was something new as a collision of European instruments and African forms. I mean, to way oversimplify it, but a form that took composition, as in what is written, and fused it with improvisation and put those two forms together where people would be playing something that's partially composed and partly improvised. We're kind of doing the same thing. And I feel like it's important with this music to make it clear that that's what's happening. We're inventing something culturally and spiritually right now that is responding to the way things have become all wrapped up in orthodoxy. People spiritually are actually reaching for something new. They don't want to say, I believe in this, and we're these people, and we stand for this. They want to get focused. They want to get relaxed. They want to create a feeling in themselves of openness. There's a lot of practical implications of this, and people are trying to move toward that aspect of spirituality.
So you think it's more like an experience rather than a belief?
I'm really fundamentally an agnostic, which means I don't know. Like, that not knowing is my point of departure. Like, this is a process of inquiry. Like, well, what is culture and what is spirit? So this is a means of asking questions. And like, who owns culture? And what exactly do we mean by spiritual practice? Those are questions that are somehow underneath this, but you don't actually even have to know that. You don't need to know how a car works in order to drive the thing, or to have a good experience of,
Exactly.
Right?
So this is a great opportunity to bring the attention of something that is ancient in a new way. People are saying that once they move to listening to this kind of music, they have a hard time going back to traditional forms of music because there's something to it that ignites the spirit.
Yeah, I agree. It's funny. One of the best reviews I ever got from somebody is they said, hey, it's really a great cure for road rage. And people are like, I'm like stuck on the freeway commuting to work. And so I put in a Mantra record, and somehow, it just felt better. And I think there's also a misperception that this music is super chilled out. It's not. It's actually quite buoyant and celebrative in a lot of ways. I mean, yeah, it definitely has its introspective moments, has a lot of them, but but at the same time, it's celebrating like it's a party.
It's uplifting.
It's uplifting.
That's what you feel when you hear it.
Yeah.
Well, this is a great creation, and I'm so happy to be sharing this with you, Dave. Madi was telling us he worked for 7 years on the album. You've been doing this for more than 30 years. So this is actually kind of a staple of a long journey.
Yeah.
And I think you guys are going with a great opportunity, and hopefully it's going to turn out to be the best.
Yeah. There's more where this is coming from. So, and hopefully it seeds a lot of other people, or at least it shines the light on other artists. There are a lot of new voices coming up really throughout the world that are expressing music in this way. I mean, we've had audiences in, everywhere from, China to Brazil to Berlin to, it's a worldwide phenomenon. And the fact that in some ways it's not sung in a vernacular language, by and large, makes it the same experience for everybody. And if you want to take a journey into the philosophy behind the mantras, you can do that. But you can also just perceive the sound, like the singing, as a beautiful instrument. In the same way, if you listen to, say, a jazz singer scat singing, You can feel that, and we've now, at least world music has opened things up in a lot of ways where people are used to hearing people sing in other languages, and it's not really a barrier anymore. And in fact, in some ways, it's tuning our ears in really interesting ways, you know. So
yes, and ultimately it achieves the goal of yoga, that is to basically cease the activity of the mind.
yeah, it's funny. Ages ago, the first time I remember going to Rome, what struck me was that they built all of these cathedrals using the marble from the ancient temples. You know, like they were literally building a new religion with the bricks and stones of the old one. In some ways, I think we're doing the same thing. We're taking the marble pieces from these traditions of both Hinduism and Sufism and Christianity, and we're taking those stones and we're building something new with it. We're taking the stones of Eastern ideas about raga and the effect of melodies on your emotions, and we're fusing those with Western ideas about harmony and creating a new temple from the stones of the old one.
This is definitely a new thing, and I believe most of the people who are going to listen to this album are going to feel something unique about it. So thank you so much for your contribution, for your work, and
it's a pleasure.
All the best in this journey. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Daniel.
Om Namo, Om Namo.